Hello, and welcome to the second episode of Between the Lines, the Independent Restaurant Coalition series that features conversations with authors who inspire and inform. My name is John Schumacher, and I'm part owner in an independent restaurant in Charleston, South Carolina called Harold's Cabin. And today I'm joined by Steve Palmer, author of Say Grace, How the Restaurant Business Saved My Life. Steve is a best-selling author, a TEDx speaker, a James Beard semifinalist, industry leader, mental health advocate, restaurateur, and founding and manager partner and chief vision officer of the nationally recognized Indigo Road Hospitality Group. Steve launched what will become his proudest accomplishment in 2016 when he co-founded Ben's Friends with his friend Mickey Bass, food and beverage industry support group offering hope, fellowship, and a path forward to professionals who struggle with substance abuse and addiction. Welcome, Steve.
Thank you, John. Thank you for the thoughtful introduction. It's always, when you hear what you've done on paper, it's always a little, it's humbling. And I just love our business. I feel so fortunate and so thankful that I've been able to have the career that I have, and most importantly, that I've been able to give back. Because I would be dead if it wasn't for the restaurant industry. So, from that perspective, feels like there's so much more that still can be done.
And you, my friend, are part of that. So just to give people a brief synopsis who haven't had the pleasure of picking up your book yet, I'd like to give a little bit of a background on that, so they're familiar with it. As a child, you always felt that you never belonged, not in school, not in trouble at home, not with friends. Your father and your grandfather passed away when you were young, and then you were sent to a series of rehab halfway houses before ending up on the streets. And drug and alcohol became a way of life. Before finding success running some of the country's most celebrated fine dining establishments, you had to learn how to be sober in an industry awash in alcohol and drugs. And thankfully, for a couple of coworkers who basically found a way to love you when you couldn't love yourself, you got sober and you escaped addiction alive. But so many of our industry do not. And no other industry has a higher rate of alcohol and drug abuse. People are losing careers and families, they're losing their health, and they're losing their lives. Say Grace is a story of how you found healing and recovery in an industry that enabled the addiction. And it's a story about your quest to help others do the same. So I was interested when reading the book. You entitled it Say Grace, How the Restaurant Business Saved My Life. What brought you to go with that title?
It's interesting. I mean, it's kind of a double entendre, or it's a double title. But thanks, John, for asking. The first part of it, Say Grace. I mean, if you grew up in the South the way I did, right before dinner, often Sunday supper, you would say grace, and you would give thanks for the food and for the nourishment, and it was very much when I say the term, think about a Southern table. And so that very much resonated with me. The word grace, one of the definitions of grace is a gift given without expectation of return. And boy, that statement, there's so many restaurant references you can think about But you know, that giving grace as it relates to being sober, you know, I was somebody that my father, as you mentioned, my father and grandfather died when I was 10 and 11. My grandfather's funeral was on my 11th birthday, and you know, he captain of the Georgia Bulldogs, World War II vet. I mean, just this huge, larger than life hero. And when he died, I started drinking. I started drinking at 11 years old, and I mean, I started drinking alcoholically. Like, I didn't know you were supposed to mix liquor. I was sneaking it out of my parents, out of my mom's liquor cabinet, and it was the relief I found. And you know, without getting too into sort of that road, when I found the restaurant business, even with all of its flaws, right? I mean, 30 or 40 years ago in our industry, you know, the chefs were screaming and yelling and throwing plates. People were doing drugs in the walk-in. But it was the first place in my life where I felt accepted. And I say this today, like, the beautiful thing about the restaurant business is everybody's welcome. It doesn't matter what the color of your skin is, where you grew up, if you have money, if you didn't have money. At least my experiences, I can only speak from my experiences, but if you are willing to work hard and you want to be a part of a team, you don't have to have a college degree. You just have to be there. And that, when I found that in the restaurant industry, for all of its dysfunction, for all of the out 7 nights a week partying, for all of the toxic environment, there was beauty. There was beauty for me in the acceptance. Like, hey, we love you as you are. Come on in. You're welcome. And that was really, for me as a kid, that was the first time I had found that. So that's where the title comes from, how the restaurant industry saved my life, because even in those years, John, had I not found the restaurant industry, I mean, because by 17 or 18, I mean, I was an IV drug user, like, I was in bad shape. And had I not found the industry, I truly believe I would be dead. Had those two individuals later not done an intervention, I would definitely be dead. And so, um, it's interesting in this post-pandemic world in our industry, and even prior to the pandemic, there are a lot of criticisms about our industry, a lot of reckoning that has taken place, all very needed, right? And how we treat each other and how we speak to each other and compensation and all these big things. But what I think doesn't get talked enough about is the love and acceptance that the restaurant industry brings for so many people, and the platform to excel. And I am a living example of, I mean, I have an 8th grade education. You know, I never went to college. I am a living example of, you can achieve a lot in the business if you're willing to work hard.
You mentioned in the book, there's two things that you owe your life to. The one's the hospitality industry, and the other is the recovery community. You want to share a little bit about those two communities and what role they've played in your life?
Sure. You know, I was working at Magnolia's, which is a Charleston restaurant. It was like 1990 or 1991. I mean, I was a kid. I was 21, 22, and somebody said to me, "Steve, people don't go out to eat just for the sake of eating. If they did that, they would stay home and eat and save the money. People go out to have an experience, or they go out to feel something, right? And if we deliver that, then what a blessing, what a privilege. You're in the front row of their first date, their anniversary, their old friends who haven't seen each other, you know, and that resonated even at a young age. I was like, wow, I'm here to create an experience. And then I found a lot of joy in serving other people, I still do. And then I can get paid for it. Whoa. That was, that was like, even, and this is before the internet and before Top Chef and before foodies and,
Right.
but this idea of like that I could get paid doing something that I really, really loved. And yes, there were all the things that have been so well highlighted about, there were all the wrong things about drug and alcohol abuse, toxic environments, all of that was prevalent. But I was so blessed that I worked in some really positive environments and had these great mentors that shown me like, man, if you have passion for this industry, you can do well. And I still say it to this day. I'm not the smartest guy. There are restaurateurs who are more articulate than I am. But I've never lost the passion for serving other people. And that I believe has been the reason I've been successful. So in that way, even in my darkest of darks, the hospitality business, I always showed up for work, even if I was hungover. I never no-showed. I never stole, like the cardinal sins of our industry. Like I was always there. I might have been a train wreck, but I was there and I was at work. And the industry welcomed me. And even in the throes of my addiction, I was getting promoted and I was taking on other opportunities. I became a sommelier. I became a general manager. I went to work in the hotel industry for a little while just because I was curious about how food and beverage interacts with hotels. And so that's really how the hospitality business sustained me. And then of course, when I came to work one day, I was the general manager of a restaurant called Peninsula Grill, and it was 2001. And the owner of the restaurant said, so you have a choice today. You can go to rehab or you can clean out your office. And, in 2001, we were not having this conversation. We weren't talking about mental health. We weren't talking about any of this. And so every fiber in my being wanted to tell him, F you, I'm out. I don't have a problem. But there was something in me that I was sick and tired of being sick and tired. And I said, I'll do it. And I wasn't even sure that it was possible, right, John? I mean, I was the wine buyer and GM at Peninsula Grill, and I'm like, how's this going to work? But I thought, you know what? I will do everything that I'm told to do. I will do everything that I'm shown to do. And then if it doesn't work, I at least know that I tried. 21 years later, I haven't felt it necessary to take a drink. But but that was a lonely time to be sober in the industry because people in the sober community were going, you need to get out of the restaurant industry. That's a very toxic, like you need to get out. And yet I had this deep love for it, right? And then people in the restaurant business, because again, we were not talking about mental health. They were saying, man, there's no way you're going to be able to stay sober. And then, come on, you're going to not drink.
I'm sure people were betting against you.
Yeah, I actually heard, how when you go to a Super Bowl party, there's you can bet on a square for what the score is. I heard at one point that some bartenders around town had a betting square on how long I was going to stay sober, man. It was a different town back then, it was a much smaller industry, but still fun. But yeah, I heard there were bets.
Yeah, you often just in our brief conversation talk about the duality of the hospitality industry. They're the most passionate and caring people to work in this industry, but there's also the inability of these people to take care of themselves or know how to take the first step, or for others either to offer or even to ask for help. Do you have any thought on why that exists and possibly what we can do to address that?
Yeah, I say this a lot, John, but the real tragic thing about Ben Murray, who is the chef that took his life, which was who Ben's Friends is named after. So Ben was opening a restaurant with us in Florence, South Carolina, Town Hall, and he had been struggling. We had opened a restaurant called Canoe in the mid '90s together in Atlanta. I hadn't seen Ben in a while. We were short staffed. Somebody said, "Hey, Ben's available." I never saw Ben take a drink. And one night after work, Ben went to his hotel room and killed himself. Here's the tragedy. In that kitchen that night were three sober chefs, like people that were actively working a program of recovery. All Ben had to do was say, "I'm struggling. Can we talk after work?" Or how are you able to do this? Because I can't seem to. And boy, did that, like afterwards, like what was it about our culture? And I think that's what you're asking. And it's several things. I mean, I think that it's been for a long time, the kitchen culture, right? It's
Right.
been a very macho, toxic, like you better not show weakness. You better show us that you can handle it.
Right.
And
And
so
you talk about it. Yeah. Yeah. You talk about it as a code of silence.
yeah, and it's like to show that vulnerability and to say, "I'm not okay," and I that was the thing that Mickey Bax, my Ben's friend's co-founder, and that was the thing that was like to us the genesis of like people are dying and there is help available. We got to fix this. And so that was kind of, but yeah, I mean, to answer your question more specifically, I think it's just been the kitchen culture, restaurant culture, I mean, modern culture. I mean, how many of us, I mean, again, I think through moments like this, we as a culture are getting okay with not being okay. That's one of my favorite things. Like just saying like, I'm not okay
Right.
and that being
Right.
okay, you know?
Yeah. It wasn't accepted back then. It wasn't even talked about back then to be able
No,
to admit that you need help or you just need some guidance or just a conversation.
right.
Thankfully now it's a little more accessible, but certainly not where we need to be. You know,
Yeah.
and when I was reading your book, you were talking about that word surrender. When you were, on the road to recovery and you had to do wine service
Yeah.
at a table, and that word jumped off the pages at me when I saw that. You want to talk a little bit more about that moment?
Sure. I had come home from rehab and I was, again, as I said, I was the GM of Peninsula Grill and the ownership had held my job. So I was back at the first pre-service. I was at the first lineup. And I mean, I often equate early sobriety. When a baby's first born and they're wiggling their toes and then you can tell they're like,
Right.
"Oh wow, that's attached to me." Like that's how early sobriety feels, right? You
Oh
feel like
wow.
you've just come out of the womb into the world, and you're like, "Oh my God, I don't know how to pay my bills. I don't know how to socially interact." So I was at lineup and I was scared to death. And so we get into service and it was a busy Saturday night. Server comes up, hands me the bottle of wine, says, "Can you go open this on table 20?" Like, I can't do this. And I remember very distinctly thinking, um, as a believer that everything happens for a reason, I probably didn't just go to rehab because I'm supposed to start drinking again. Somehow, I think there are bigger forces at work here, right?
Yeah.
And that word surrender, it just came to mind and there was a peace that came over me, and it was basically like, you're going to be okay. You don't have to fight this. You're right where you're supposed to be. You're supposed to be sober in a restaurant working. Just put one foot in front of the other. And I went back downstairs and I was okay. And that word surrender, it's, there's so many stories about surrender to win, in order to have the life you want, you have to let go. And I saw something recently that it connects to the word. It said addiction is giving up everything for one thing. Recovery is giving up one thing for everything. And that truly, man, that to me is that word surrender.
Yeah, that's beautifully articulated. Because so many people associate surrender or surrendering as a fault, as a weakness.
Right.
But it was where you found your strength, is when you surrendered to that moment. So, if it's not too personal, obviously you made reference to Sheldon Weinstein, who is your sponsor.
Yep.
Can you share a little bit about Sheldon and what role he played with you?
Sure. So I very much went the road of the 12-step community when I got out, because that was the only alternative there was. And in that community, there are people called sponsors that are, they have put together long-term sobriety, and they're willing to help others. And, so I'm 32 at this point. My father died when I was 10. So I hadn't had any real male, strong male, spiritually fit people in my life. And Sheldon, man, he was a godsend, and he was much older. He was not, I had this idea in my head about, well, this is what, these are the people I need to help me get sober. And he was not one of them. But he was exactly what I needed. And he taught me very early about the power of spoken word, about doing what you say you're going to do when you say you're going to do it. If we're going to meet at this Starbucks to talk about recovery at 5 o'clock, you don't show up at 10 after 5. And because I remember I showed up at 10 after 5 and he was gone once, and he was like, you're not doing what you, and he taught me just like how powerful that is, to be able to trust yourself enough to actually say, I'm going to do this. I'm going to be at work on time. I'm going to pay my bills on time. I'm going to do this. If you ask me for something, I'm going to do it for you. And that changed my whole life. And he was the first person in my life that had ever held me accountable in that way. And he was very much somebody who walked the walk. And I think, whether it's addiction or anything in life, when we look to people for inspiration, we often resonate with the people that are walking a path, right, that we admire, and they've done that. And, he was sober 20 years at that point. He's been sober over 40 years now. And that was inconceivable to me, of not taking a drink for 20 years. But it wasn't like I didn't get a pat on the butt and I didn't get thrown a parade. Like, it was, a lot of times it was tough love, right? Because addiction, unfortunately, the nature of addiction is dishonesty and theft and lying and stealing and all those things, right? Just no integrity, because addiction takes that from you. And so a lot of times it was tough love. But I really and truly, he looked at me, I was probably 8 weeks sober, and I was talking about being in the business and just all the stuff. And he looked at me, he said, if you're willing to do the work, you can do anything that you want to do. Sobriety is not about being limited, it's about being free, if you're willing to do the work. And that, John, was like, we were in the car on Lockwood turning right on Calhoun. Like, I can remember exactly where I was sitting, because it changed the way I saw things. He was like, this isn't about living less of a life, man. This is about living more of a life, but you got to do the work. Right.
Right. And you obviously talked a little bit about Ben Murray and the group you started. It's bensfriendshope.com. Do you want to talk a little bit about the program and how it's working and just everything about it?
Sure. So after Ben committed suicide, Mickey Baxt and I, who is a sober person who's recently retired from the restaurant business in Charleston, Mickey and I got together and we said, we have to do something. And I think our vision for Ben's Friends at that time was a local Charleston support group. So we started meeting at the cigar factory every Sunday. And we kind of thought, it'll be this thing. 10 or 12 people are coming. It'll be a great thing for our community. About 6 months later, Anthony Bourdain committed suicide. And it was like literally overnight. The New York Times reached out. The LA Times reached out. The media was hearing about this Ben's Friends. And so they would interview Mickey or I, they would write about Ben's Friends. And then a chef in that city who happened to be sober would go, well, I want to start a Ben's Friends. We need this. And I will tell you, I mean, we're in 29 cities now, from San Francisco to New York to Texas to, um, Mickey and I had no idea what was about to happen. And, about a year after we started, COVID hit, or a couple years, COVID hit. And, the enemy of recovery is isolation. And I think if you talk to a lot of addicts at the end of their drugging and drinking, they were alone, right? Because they were trying to hide how messed up they were. So we were very concerned, like, how are we going to meet? And so we went to Zoom and we said, we'll do a national meeting every day. We'll ask, Philip Spears, our chair in Austin, Texas, does the Saturday one. Gregory Gourdet from Portland, I believe, does. Right. So we'll ask all the different cities to chair a meeting. We now have 21 meetings on Zoom. There are women's meetings. There are spouse support meetings. We have people Zooming in from Spain, Canada, New England, London, like all over the world. And I just can't tell you. When you see someone come into their first meeting and there's just darkness and there's no hope, and they're just beat up, and then you see that person, I'm going to get emotional, but then you see that person a year later and they have light in their eyes and they have hope. John, I've opened a lot of restaurants, and all of that is, I love my day job. Nothing I'm ever going to do is more powerful than the privilege of giving back, of being a small part. We certainly, Ben's Friends doesn't take credit for getting people sober. The individual has to do the work. But we've created this community now where people, you could walk into a Ben's Friends meeting, and even though you may not know anybody in the room, they're your people. There's a line cook sitting there, there's a dishwasher, there's a bartender, and they know what 8 o'clock on a Saturday night feels like. They know what everybody going out to drink after work when you shouldn't feels like. And the power in that community is so much bigger than content or Mickey and I, or, it's just the power of that community, because a line cook can walk in and he can't imagine going 24 hours with a drink. And there's another line cook across from him going, I haven't had a drink in 7 months and it's okay. And that connection is stronger. We want to be in every city in America. I give a lot of credit to Mickey. Mickey retired from his job, so he is full-time Ben's Friends, and he is lighting the torch from across the nation. And, he's doing so much of the work, and there's so many other people now. And Ben's Friends is, so much bigger than Mickey and I, which is exactly what it should be, and what we always hope for. But just dude, it's the most important thing I will ever do in my life. And I talk about this a lot because perspective is a funny thing. So, as you would imagine, on these Zoom meetings or meetings, heavy stuff is getting talked about, right? Addiction is heavy. Yeah. And some people, they just can't see past like that 24 hours. They want to drink so bad. And I always say, like, remember that this community, right, was built out of somebody committing suicide. So out of this terrible thing, I mean, suicide in our culture is one of the worst things that can possibly happen, right? But out of that absolute tragedy is now this beautiful community. And I just think about that a lot. Like even in our darkest moments, something beautiful can happen if we're just willing to give it a chance.
Yeah, you're gonna make me emotional now.
Sorry, man. I always am like, I cry, like I'll run into Ben's family and they're just so blown away with, it's an emotional thing. It's an emotional thing.
Yeah,
Human beings getting another chance to live a better life, man. What's more powerful than that?
yeah, yeah. When you were the GM and cutting your teeth, little did you know what was in store for you
Right.
and what you were going to create or be a part of. So I remember specifically in the book when you were talking about a young woman who came into a meeting and the look on her face that first day, that just that washed over look, and then alluding to it later in the book when you came across her after a time period had gone by, and you specifically remember seeing the light in her eyes again.
Yeah.
Just that's the ongoing story and epic that continues to happen, hopefully. So,
Yeah.
you talk about the grace in the community of the industry, and we're moving in a direction, but you specifically talk about how we can do better.
Yeah.
What in your eyes is better? What do you define as better? What can we do?
So, it was interesting when I first got sober, and for many, many years, I never wanted to project. And when I started the Indigo Road, I never wanted to project my sobriety on my business. And what I mean by that is I was like, the shift drink, right? All of these sort of time honored things that happen in a restaurant. I didn't want to like come off as like this pious holy roller that now that I've stopped drinking, that everybody, my wife drinks. She doesn't have the issue of addiction. But one day I was in a conversation with our managers and I said, what if we just said we're not going to drink at work? Like at all. We're not going to sit at the bar at the end of the night and have a drink. If we want to go do that down the street, that's great. But this is our place of work. So we went to completely alcohol free as a company. And what I was so surprised at is every single manager was like, we think that's great. And so that sounds small, but like those little moments that you can make a statement as a restaurant, like, hey, we're not telling you alcohol is bad, but we're trying to be more professional. You know this. We need more people to work in our industry, not less. We
Right.
need people to see our industry as like, I can have a career here. I can grow and I can get promoted and I can make more money and I can have a family. We offer free mental health. Like if you want to go see a therapist, we'll pay for it. We've done things like we did this home loan buying program where I went to my two investors because I'm a worker bee. I have investors. And I said, what if we put $50,000 in a pot? It's a finite amount of money. And we gave it to our employees to buy homes. We make no money on it. It's interest free, but they have to pay it back in 3 years. 18 people have bought homes. So
Wow.
these are small things, and $50,000 is a lot of money. But when you think about what it costs to build a restaurant these days, it's really not a lot of money. I mean, it honestly, we've never had anybody default on the loan. Like my HR director was initially like, well, what are you going to do if everybody has paid back the loan? Like, I'm like, we have to operate from on a place of optimism, right? We have to believe in the best of people. I think you have to have a culture where you're at your pre-service meetings, you're saying things like, if you're not okay, let us know. You have to positively embrace You know, I'll walk through one of our restaurants and a bartender who doesn't even identify as having a problem or anything. Hey, Steve, how's Ben's friends going? You know, and he's excited that he works for a company that cares about people, right? So I think you change it, not to sound too cliche, but we change our industry one restaurant at a time, right? I mean, we just make it a better
Right.
place to work. Don't yell and scream at each other. Don't tolerate that behavior under any circumstances. Um, you know, we do family meal every day. We, you know, even as we have a lot of restaurants, we close for summer break in July and winter break in January, just as a statement like that. Yes, we're a for-profit business, but we care about the people in this business. So go take some time off, 4th of July. So I think there's 100 little things that you can do.
Right.
But you have to walk it and you have to talk about it all the time. We're always talking about our culture is internal hospitality. And we took it from Danny Meyer, and Will Guidera is a friend who did the first one of these series. You know, and it's simply put, if you want your guests to have a great experience, make sure your employees are having a great experience. If that,
Right.
you know, and so I mean, we could talk for hours about our industry and how to make it better, but I think you can start with little things. I think sometime if you're a 60-seat restaurant, you know, you hear what the Indigo wrote, you're like, well, yeah, they're a restaurant group. They can do that. But I'll tell
Right.
you, it's most of this costs nothing.
Right. Yeah, it is walking the walk and talking the talk on a daily basis, and being present. You know, being
Yes.
present at all times, especially the little times. You know, the crucial ones are going to come, but those little ones make such a huge difference on a daily basis. Um, and Erica was talking a little bit before we started about, you know, still hurting through everything as a result of COVID. What's changed with Ben's friends as a result of COVID? Have you had to pivot a little?
Yeah, I mean, when we went to Zoom, obviously we it was interesting. When we went to Zoom at first, it was like, well, okay, I mean, everybody's at home and locked down. So of course there's 50 people on the screen right now for this meeting. What we weren't sure is as we, you know, that period, you know it, that we were halfway there. We were at
Right.
50% capacity or whatever. You were doing to go, all the crazy stuff that we all know is not a sustainable business model, but we were just doing things to try and stay busy. I wasn't sure if the Zoom would continue because I thought, well, everybody will go back to work. So what's crazy is our Zoom meetings are busier than they've ever been. And there we keep adding more of them every week. There's a late night. I just got off work at 11 o'clock meeting. There's a men's meeting. There's a women's meeting. Um, and so that was our big pivot from COVID. And what we realized was people want to be connected. And if COVID taught us anything, like we need each other, man. We need each other. Like I can remember, you know, being back in one of our restaurants on King Street and seeing people there, and I thought, man, I get to do what I love again. And you know, there was a period there. It was a pretty small window, but there was a period when the governor shut us down. I was sitting on the beach. I was newly married and I, you know, thinking about my leases, my landlords, and how much money I owed the
Right.
bank. And I looked at my wife, and you know, this was when it was like apocalyptic, and then it was all going away. And I said, I'm not sure how this is going to go. And we
Right.
just got married, and my wife is amazing. Um, but that feeling of like, I've been working for 30 years in an industry. I finally got the privilege of owning my own restaurant with investors, and it's about to all be taken away. Um, you know, that was tough, man. I mean, that was like, what am I going to do? And so to be able to get to come back from that, I think that we all have a lot more gratitude. Even in this environment where we're short staffed, we don't have the people we need to do the work. And yet people want to go out to dinner more than they ever have, right?
Yes.
So I think, yeah, right. Which is a blessing and a curse. But I think for us, the Ben's Friends, the big pivot was people still want to hang out on Zoom. And so we literally have people from all over the world come every day at 1. They click on to bensfriendshope.com and there are people from everywhere. It's pretty cool.
It's no, it's absolutely amazing to hear the story of how it all came about. And, maybe on this road that so many people go down, maybe the Zoom makes it a little bit more comfortable and easier for people, that they're actually, on a computer screen as opposed to sitting in a room where they might feel a little bit more intimidated. Maybe the Zooms has helped grow the group. Maybe I don't know, maybe it's more accessible for certain folks.
I would agree wholeheartedly. And I think, walking into that room can be an intimidating thing. For me, it was an AA meeting. That first time you're walking in, it's scary. You don't know what, you don't know what you don't know. You're in a bad place, and that's about it. I often joke, nobody ends up at an AA meeting by accident, right? Whoops,
Right.
I got lost on my way to, that doesn't happen. I think you're exactly right, John. I think Zoom made it okay for a lot of people. What was interesting at one point on the West Coast, so the one day I zoomed in and I was leading a Sunday meeting, and I noticed that in one of those little Zoom squares, there were girls from the Seattle group with girls from the Portland group. And it took me a minute to register. And I finally was like, hey, what are y'all doing? And they said, we're the Ben's Friends Femmes. And we just decided that we wanted to, and this was when things were still pretty locked down. They were in a state park in between Seattle and Portland, and they had, through getting comfortable on Zoom, to your point, they decided they wanted to meet each other, and they drove, and they were so. Yeah, I think Zoom it's a great way for people to feel safe and feel comfortable and walk into a meeting and realize, like, it's just people that look a lot like them. They're going through the
Yep.
same exact things. That's again, that's that power of the community. When you realize you're not alone, because addiction tells you a lot of lies. And I think one of the biggest one of them is nobody's as bad as I am, right? There's all this shame around addiction. There's all this loathing and judgment. And when you start to hear other people's stories and you're like, I can relate to that. I can relate to that. I felt like that. That's when the cloud starts to lift. And I think Zoom gave that to a lot of people that might not have that might not have otherwise walked into the room.
Right. It's truly an inspiration to not only, experience the book, and I know how difficult it must have been to try and maybe relive all that, and put it down in print. But I know, or I think I know, your way of thinking is it's part of your process to serve and to give back. And maybe if one person picks up the book, maybe it can make a difference to help them or others. And it's truly inspiring what you've done with the book and what you've done with Ben's Friends. And I can't sing the praises enough of stepping out, and surrendering and making it happen.
Well, thanks, man. for several years, once I kind of got my feet under me, Mickey and I would go to breakfast and we would say, man, we got to do something to give back. We didn't know what it was. And then we were like, maybe we should start a group. And then we were both sat back down at breakfast the following week and we were both like, we're too busy. And when Ben killed himself, I just, I mean, if you experience a moment like that in your life, I think most people would feel compelled to react in a way. And like I'll say it a million times, John, I feel so privileged that I get to watch people come back from that. And look, the numbers are still pretty crappy in terms of success rate. It's about 10% for every 10 alcoholics out there, probably one is going to get sober. But to be in an industry and to see it now, and to see us talking about mental health, and to like, even like the non-alcoholic cocktails that are on everybody's menu now, those little moments of like, you said it, we take care of other people every night. We're just now learning to take care of ourselves. And that will be a lifelong journey. Obviously, there's no sort of end point to that endeavor, but at least we're now on the journey. I feel like as an industry, we're on the road now, which is pretty awesome. And you see it in a lot of different ways. Our chair, Philip Spears in Austin, who I mentioned, he started a sober run club, and it's called the Commodore Run Club. And now people show up, every I think it's on Mondays to run together. I mean, just those little things that we can like, hey man, you can't work 16 hours a day, whatever, serving hundreds of meals a night and just believe that it's not going to take its toll, because it will.
It will.
Yeah.
So, and for those of you, thanks again. We could talk for hours, probably days.
Yeah, I know, man. I love our industry so much, man. It's so good. And the best people I know are restaurant people. We're the best. And we'll do anything for anybody. And it's just I'm just glad that moments like this and the Independent Restaurant Coalition, I mean, this came out of COVID. I mean, all these things that come out of dark moments in our life, just they're making our industry better, and I think it's great.
Yeah, it's just taking the time again to be there for one another. So,
That's right.
That's right. Again. And for those of you, there's the book. I'm doing a shameless promo, so share it with your colleagues. But also, there may be someone who needs it, so think about it from that perspective too.
And 100% of the proceeds go to Ben's friends. So buy a book, you're donating to a cause.
All right. So IRC obviously is committed to building a brighter future for restaurants, bars, and their teams. The communities we all support. Become a member or join our mailing list by visiting independentrestaurantcoalition.com. Steve, thank you.
Thank you, friend. Appreciate you.